actually thought of trying to buy a poster and framing it and hanging it in my house, but if you look at this picture, you'll notice that it's a depiction of an ancient view of a reality. That on the right-hand side there you see this bucolic scene of a little village by a lake with a little hill and some trees, and then you see the arch of the dome of the sky with the stars attached to the bottom and the sun, moon, and stars. But the part that intrigues me is down in the right-hand corner you have a very curious human being who has managed to get over to the edge of the world to where the dome of the sky touches down, and he's poked his head through to see what's behind all of that. And it intrigues me that if you look at this, in the top left-hand corner there's a wheel within a wheel, and to the right there are rolling spheres. And if you know Christian hymnody, you know that, and Ezekiel 1, you know about a wheel within a wheel and rolling spheres, and this man is trying to understand what's behind what we normally see, and it kind of depicts what I want to do here. So the story in Genesis 1 begins with the words, "in the beginning," and I would like to stop right there. In the beginning. And ask what assumptions or concepts sit behind those three words. And of course the first one is that there was a point of beginning. And it's interesting to me that for a long time there was a big disagreement between theologians and scientists. Scientists didn't want to talk about a beginning, but after the Big Bang Theory was discovered, then we talk now, everybody agrees that there was a beginning. There are big discussions about when the beginning was. And I don't know, when they talk about 7.8 billion years, I think there's probably room for major errors in such a large calculation, but I will leave that alone. I would like to make the observation that I do not think Genesis 1 is a statement about the earliest beginnings. Okay? I think it's a commentary on the establishment of life on planet Earth. Because if you read the story, it does not support creation ex nihilo, the creation out of nothing. And it's very simple to see that because it says the world was what? It was without form and void. In other words, it was chaotic, so there appears to have been something there. Now, I do think that the beginning of beginnings is addressed in John chapter 1 and verse 1. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was divine. That, I think, is a discussion about the way back. All right? And I think ex nihilo is supported by John 1:1. I don't think it's supported by Genesis 1. And by the way, the whole doctrine of ex nihilo is an interesting one because it was created in response to the argument from scientists that matter itself must have been eternal. And theologians said, no, God created matter, and so they concocted, and I shouldn't use that word, they created, or they defined is a better word, they defined the doctrine of creation ex nihilo in order to retain the eternality of God, not the eternality of matter. And so I'm not against ex nihilo. I think it's a correct opinion, but it should be supported by John 1:1, not Genesis 1:1, my opinion. Now, I would like to make the point that the biblical story is a story of order overcoming chaos. And I should probably reserve remarks in detail on that a little later, but I would make the observation that to the ancient people, the question of order and chaos was a very big one. In fact, some of the ancient earth religions were built around this whole idea of order and chaos, because the ancient people understood that if the natural world became chaotic, they were all going to die. And this is one reason why in the fall they were somewhat alarmed, because everything was dying. It's one reason why on December 25 there was a great Bacchanalian feasting, because by that point they could tell that the cycle of life had shifted. And you perhaps know that the reason this Christmas for Christians is on December 25 is that it was a very successful attempt by Christians to overshadow the Bacchanalian element. And if you're up on your current events, you may know that paganism is resurging and they want their day back. They want Christianity to surrender December 25, because we all know Jesus wasn't born there, that's a day that originally had pagan significance, but Christians overshadowed that with the story of Christmas, much like some people today try to cover Halloween with harvest parties and stuff. So anyway, I'm rambling a little bit here. One of the things that this story tells us, in the beginning. We discover by this that time is an element of reality. And I don't know if you know this, you would have had to spend some time in philosophy to know this, but that fact speaks to one of the greatest and most consequential debates in all human history. And here's where things get a little bit abstract, but behind a lot of the discussions of how reality is comported is this discussion of time. What is the relationship between time and ultimate reality? This discussion was started by the Greek philosophers, and it has resonated down through history, and it has had an enormous effect on Christian theology. In fact, I have one theologian who's written that what you decide about this issue is probably the single most consequential decision you can make theologically. And I find that fascinating because we don't even know, most of us, that there has been a long debate about the relationship of time to ultimate reality. Now, this falls under the category of being in philosophy, and if you want to have some fun sometime and stretch your brain, go and try and figure out what being is. You can Google it today, and you can read and read and read, and I wish you well. But it basically is a discussion of the qualities that pertain to ultimate reality. So it's not really a discussion of existence itself. It's a discussion of what kind of characteristics or qualities are found where ultimate reality is described, okay? And I think in a simple way, it boiled down to a debate over the question of ultimate reality being either static or dynamic, okay? And you understand that if time is an element of ultimate reality, then reality is dynamic because time always produces change, okay? If time is not a factor, then ultimate reality is static. And I will talk a little bit more about this. For many of the Greeks, and this is particularly true of Plato, and folks, I have to tell you, I am deficient in my understanding of Greek philosophy. I only ever took one philosophy class in my life, and I wish I had taken more. I am not so much interested in the philosophers, because they have all kind of crazy ideas. I am interested in philosophy, the function of philosophy, and that's something that I think in conservative Christian societies has been overlooked. Unfortunately, we're advised not to study philosophy. Well, that's fine if you don't want to delve into the philosophers, but the function of philosophical endeavor is a very valuable thing to understand. But anyway, for Plato, ultimate reality consisted of a collection of perfect ideas that he called forms. And so he proposed that there is a two-tiered universe. There's the realm of forms, where all the ideals and ideas sit in absolute perfection, and then there's the material realm, which is a representation of the ideal. For example, I could say to you that there is an ideal for a loaf of bread. It's an idea, and if you bake a loaf of bread, your bread is an approximation of the ideal. I don't think anybody here would bake a loaf of bread and come and say, Dave Thomas, this is a perfect loaf. See? And so for Plato, the ideal world was where the ideas were situated, and the real world was a representation of it. And I'll just read this quotation. For Plato, his forms or ideas are prior to any instance of an object with a given form. So the forms exist before the representations of them. They exist in another realm that is more real than the everyday physical world of material objects. The forms are properly outside of time. So for him, the realm of forms was static. It was outside of time. And the reason for that is simply this, that if something is perfect, it cannot change to become more perfect, right? If it's already perfect and it changes, it will only tend toward imperfection, not perfection. And so, in consequence, if you envision a realm in which being is already perfect, it has to be timeless. It cannot be affected by time because it will change, and if it changes, it will then change toward imperfection. And so for Plato, this was very important to talk about timelessness. He envisioned these forms existing outside of the dimension of time. And that's a very interesting thing to think about because actually a realm like that would be non-material. There's nothing material there. It's like a collection of mathematical formulas. Okay, it's static. It doesn't change. Everything is there in its grand perfection. It never changes. That's the kind of thing that Plato envisioned. Now, this debate, as I mentioned, has had a massive effect on Christian theology, because when Christianity emerged and Christians began to try and describe Christianity in the kind of language that the Greeks understood, they had to decide, well, in which realm are you going to put God? Are you going to put God in the temporal world, the material realm, or are you going to put him in the realm of forms? And of course, nobody wanted to put God down where humans are. And so theologically they put God in the same category as forms. But what happens to God when you do that? Well, the first thing that happens is that you rob him of any real substance. Okay? God is not a person anymore. He's an idea or a collection of ideas. Okay? You put him in a zone where there's no past and no future, that everything is in a static present. Okay? Everything is present with God in the moment. There's no past, there's no future, because the timeless world is unchanging. And you'll find that some theologians then talk about divine implacability, that God is not affected by anything. He is in a static state, in this, not ecstatic, but a static state in a realm of absolute perfection where everything is immediate. Okay? And actually, if you dig into the doctrine of predestination, it is anchored in this idea of the timelessness of God, because if God is timeless, then everything is known to God in the present, which means he has known from eternity past who will be saved and who will be lost. It's a necessary conclusion. It's also fascinating to me that Christian theology had to find a way to deal with the inaccessibility of God. If God is outside of time and you're inside of time, how do you gain access to him? There's no way. Okay? And so you find that in Christian theology that some go-betweens had to be discovered or defined. One of the most interesting things is that Christian theologians borrowed the idea of an immortal soul and imported it into Christianity, because if you study about an immortal soul, which Plato believed in, that the essence of a person is in their soul. That's where knowing takes place. That's where your spiritual sensibilities are. That's where conscience exists. That's where your identity is. It's not in the body, it's in the soul. And of course, an inherently immortal soul cannot die, so when you die, your soul survives and it goes to its destiny. This is not a biblical idea. It's an idea that was carried over into Christian theology because of the need to have some between a timeless God and a temporal world. It's also one reason why in some branches of Christianity the church is sacralized. It becomes an instrument with divine capacities to minister the business of God from a timeless zone into the realm of humans. Okay? And the one I know best would be in Roman Catholicism, but there are other ones where the church itself is perceived to be a divine institution, and ordination becomes a supernatural endowing of certain people with spiritual capacities that they wouldn't otherwise have. It's very interesting to me that in Protestantism and in Adventism we debate ordination. Ordination actually is merely the authorizing of somebody to perform religious functions. But we act sometimes as if it is this idea of granting people supernatural spiritual powers so that when they do things, they are effectively done for the kingdom. Anyway, I probably shouldn't get off into that there. The whole ordination thing is a rather strange debate among Protestants. Okay? Do I need to leave now? Oh, okay. Okay. So when I say that this discussion of the relationship of time to reality is an enormously significant one that sits behind this story, and it says, in the beginning, God, or in the beginning. So you see that time is a component of reality in the biblical story, which means that reality is probably dynamic. It's not static. There is a past, there's a present, and a future, and it does open up a very big debate that I am not going to talk about here because I'm not that well informed, but you may have heard about the openness of God. There's actually a book written, The Openness of God. If God is not in a timeless zone where all things are known, past, present, and future, then what can we say about his foreknowledge? See, if God's in a timeless zone, then he knows everything in the instant, and so he will know everything past, present, and future. If reality is dynamic, then you have to ask the question, well, what kind of foreknowledge does God have? And the whole debate about the openness of God grows out of that there, and I don't know how to resolve that issue. But you have to be careful, because a timeless God can also quickly become a very meddlesome one. See? So the Genesis 1 story depicts time as part of our reality. And very interestingly, God is seen acting within time and affecting space. So I do not understand, after looking at the story, even in a very preliminary manner, why Christian theologians talk about the timelessness of God. That's not the God you see in Genesis 1. He's acting within time and space. He's not removed from it. See? This is an article of great significance, okay? Another thing I want to say about time is that the Genesis 1 story gives a very clear picture of time as a linear thing, not a circular one. If you look at, in the beginning, it's a point in the past. We have moved from that point through time to where we are now, which means that we are also moving then toward a future. Okay? If you look at concepts of time, there are two main ones in worldviews: linear time and recursive time. And if you look at linear time, this, by the way, makes a very big difference to the way you look at reality. If your concept is circular, you see time as a function of reality that goes round and round like a wheel on a vertical axis. It's like a merry-go-round. And you get on it and you spin around a few times and then you fall off. Different eras go round and round, but history is not making a progress in any direction. It's not going anywhere. It's just going round and round like a merry-go-round. See, it's an interesting concept, and it's a very prevalent one in the world. There are many worldviews that subscribe to this. If time is circular, then the cosmos must have been eternal without a beginning or an ending. It's just been going round and round and round and round. Okay. History is not going anywhere. We're not going to any particular... There will be little or no incentive to change or development, okay, if time is circular. And there can be no final place of peace and rest, because we're not going anywhere. We're just going round and round. And in some of these worldviews that subscribe to circular time, you have reincarnation. You might come back at a later time and get on the merry-go-round again. And if you were good, you would be more noble, and if you were not, you would come as a lesser life form, but you would just go round and round and round. And even if you finally end up at some more ideal place, the circle of time doesn't stop, and you would probably get on it again and go round and round, and it's not going anywhere. Cultures that have this idea of circular time, there's little urgency in life. Okay? It's merely a fact that life will go on until another life takes over or another regime takes over. If time is linear, however, then time is it's compared to a wheel that's on a horizontal axis, like a wagon wheel. And as it turns, it makes progress in a particular direction. Okay? And if time is linear, life is suddenly infused with a sense of urgency that is not present in circular time. Okay? Some of you grew up with parents who told you not to waste even a moment. Why not? Because it will never come your way again, right? They subscribe to linear time. This is actually where the Protestant work ethic comes from, is that time is viewed as linear. You get it only once, it goes by, and if you don't improve it, you've wasted it, which is really an irresponsible thing to do. This difference in time concepts actually explains why human achievement is not evenly distributed in the world. It's one of the reasons why human achievement is not evenly distributed. Okay? It's also one of the reasons why, if you go to Europe, you find two very different cultures. You can go into some cities in Europe and there's a Catholic sector and there's a Protestant sector. And if you go to the Protestant sector, they're up at 6 a.m., they're working already, there's no trash lying around, everything's clean and going. And it's one reason why the best wristwatches in the world were made where? Geneva. Why in Geneva? because they had a Protestant work ethic. And if you're a good Protestant, you would not do shoddy workmanship. That reflected on your electness or absence thereof. Okay? It's why time is very, very important to people. When you wake up in the morning, what's the first thing you want to know? What time is it? Okay? You are suffering from a subscription to linear time. See? And when I say suffering, I'm being a little sarcastic. This is why if you go to Switzerland, for example, and it says that the train leaves at 11:03, what time does it leave? Yes, and if you are standing on the platform at 11:02:59, you better be aware that in the next second the door's going to close and the train's going to be gone. Now, if you go to a place where there's no Protestant work ethic, schedules are approximate. The train will leave if it's ready to leave. 12 or 11:03 or whatever I said is the ideal, but we might not make it. And what doesn't get done today can be done tomorrow. See? So I think you understand that this makes a big difference in human life. If time is linear, the cosmos would have had a beginning point. History is actually going somewhere. Change and progress and development are real things. The way you conduct yourself makes a real difference. It's not just you're on a spinning wheel. And I think it's fair to say that since there was a beginning, we can expect an ending or a destiny. Okay? And the prospect of a final resting place becomes a real possibility. In other words, time is going to go to a point of rest, and then it will no longer progress. And so in linear time, the hope of heaven is a very real hope that if you get there, you will stay there. Okay, it will be a real place. It won't go on. This is a remarkable thing when you look at the Genesis 1 story in antiquity, because most of the pagans had this idea of circular time. But the Hebrew people come marching into the desert there with this brand new idea that time is actually linear, and we are going from a point of origin to a point of destiny. And in the Adventist world, as I mentioned last night, we talk about journeying from an Eden lost to an Eden restored. See? And the sense you have is what? We're making progress. We're going in that direction. And I was just reading this morning a fascinating little article that talked about how real the hope of heaven is in the Christian realm. That if Jesus died for our sins and he rose again, then, and this was actually an article about the death of Tim Keller, the somewhat famous pastor of Redeemer Presbyterian Church in New York City. He's quite a prolific author, but he died, I think, on Thursday of pancreatic cancer. And he was talking about his hope of heaven. Now, he believes that when he dies, he'll immediately go to be with Jesus, but the hope of heaven, he said, is a very real thing, because if Jesus died and rose again and time is moving to a destiny, the way to our destiny is now open in a very realistic way. Okay? So, moving on here, in the beginning, the next word is God. And you realize that what happens here is that the story now presumes and announces the existence of deity. And I want to notice something here. Note the absence of attempts at justifying the existence of God. When I was the Dean of Theology, I cannot tell you how many people came to talk to me about whether I could justify or prove the existence of God. It's something I never expected to have to face. I spent a lot of time talking to students about the credibility of the existence of God. But in this story, there's no debate. It's an announcement. In the beginning, God. Okay? Very different from the theologians who spend their time trying to prove the existence of God. And I am fascinated, too, by the comment of Leslie Newbegin. And I'm sorry to quote him so many times, but yet I'm not sorry, because he writes about this stuff in ways that other people don't. If you want some interesting reading, write down Leslie Newbegin. You'll see his name appear on some slides. He has some fascinating books to read. But he points out there that if indeed there is a God, isn't it a strange thing that his creatures say that we have a more reliable way of believing in him than what he provided by himself? Okay? That we have to create a justification before we believe in the God who created us. It's a fascinating thing. But I would point out that the existence of God can be supported subsequently by some of the evidences and by argumentation, but it's never provable. And I will just add a comment here that in my younger years I spent a lot of time with the so-called proofs of God's existence. We are much more humble now as theologians. We talk about the evidences or the arguments that in favor of God's existence, and there are about 45 of them. I used to think to myself, well, if I can teach these to students, they will be dumb not to believe in God. And I discovered that I don't know anybody who's been persuaded by the arguments to become a theist. But once you believe in God, those arguments are wonderful. They become very powerful to sustain your belief, even though they don't they don't prove the existence of God. On the contrary, if you don't believe in the existence of God, what evidence do you have? And I had a classmate who's an atheist now who got in a debate with me on Facebook years ago, and I learned back then not to get involved in arguments on Facebook. But he basically said that you cannot produce, you cannot prove the existence of nothing. So he makes the assumption God doesn't exist, and then says you don't have to prove that because it's nothing. But anyway, moving on. Notice that in this Genesis story, a belief in God is adopted as a pre-theoretical presupposition. It's laid down at the very beginning of the story. In the beginning, time is a factor. In reality, time is linear. In the beginning, God. This is one of the foundational assumptions that exists in the biblical story. And I introduce you here to this little phrase, the ontological set, that underneath every worldview is a collection of assumptions that make up a set that is called an ontological set. Ontology, I think my next slide, no it doesn't. Ontology is actually a branch of philosophy that tries to understand how reality is comported, and these foundational assumptions undergird the thought systems, and in the biblical system, the presence of a deity is one of those assumptions. It's not debated, it's adopted, which I find very interesting. Okay, and yeah, these posits are set down before evidence is even asked for. Nobody is required to prove their posits. Okay, if you are a materialist and you said, I don't believe there's anything supernatural, that the world, the cosmos is only made up of material substance, nobody asks you to prove that. That's a posit. That's one element of your ontological set, and you adopt it and you go from there. Well, I have news for you. I'm a theist. And so if you want to know what my ontological set looks like, one of the components is that there is a divine being. I don't have to prove that. I'm telling you that's where I begin. See? And I become very happy with that position, by the way. I'm tired of debating the existence of God. I would much rather announce it. So with the announcement of deity, though, we need to stop again, because the minute you talk about deity, you uncover a whole lot of things that need to be talked about. Okay, so merely to say in the beginning God, the minute you put God, there's a whole bunch of things that are behind that we need to think about. First of all, what is the picture of reality? And I like the way I put it, the presence of a deity necessitates some kind of discussion of the kind of reality that must exist in order to accommodate him. So if you say there is a God, what's the reality that he inhabits? How does it relate to where I am dwelling? Okay? This is an ontological question, and here I think is my slide. Ontology is a branch of philosophy that is concerned with the study of the nature of existence. It seeks to understand and describe what exists, what the stuff of reality is made of, how the parts of grand reality are construed, and how they relate to each other. See? Now, this becomes very interesting because it tries to, in every worldview there is an assumed picture of reality. I call it grand reality. Okay? And that picture creates a mind map. It contextualizes your life. You have to have a picture of reality so you know where you fit in, how you make sense out of life. And in the work I have done, a primary feature of the biblical story, by the way, is a two-tiered reality with a natural created realm that is seen and a supernatural realm of unknown origins that is unseen, in which the deity dwells. Okay. But Pictures of grand reality. This has interested me that I have discovered at least 6 of these. Now, I mentioned last night there may be as many as 8. I have facility with 6 of them, and one day when I have the other 2 figured out, you can invite me back and we can talk about those, but I don't have those figured out yet. But there are 6 of them, and they provide for humans the grandest context for them, and they are all presumed to be truthful by their proponents. So what do these look like? Well, I guess this is a little reminder. No concept of grand reality is empirically provable, and what you believe about grand reality is an act of faith. You have evidences, but you finally adopt them because for some reason they make sense to you. So here are the 6 of these. The first one is the idea that reality is random. And you find people today who think that reality is random, that you cannot understand it. And I had a student at Walla Walla some years who was quite a proponent of this. And he liked a bumper sticker that said, "Stuff happens." And there were variations of that I won't speak publicly. But, you know, his approach to life was, you cannot make sense out of life. It's random, so you just take what comes. And if it's good, it's good. If it's bad, it's bad. Now, how you measure good and bad becomes a very interesting question under this. But this one, I'm confident, is not true. You know why? Because if everything is random, then if I said to you, blah, 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 it should be the same as if I gave you a cohesive sentence. See? And you cannot explain randomness by random language. You have to use structured, organized language to describe it. So it fails its own test. So this one, I'm happy to tell you, I'm very confident that a random ontology is it's a bogus idea. Okay. Another one here is this one, a spiritualized ontology. And this one believes that there is a spiritual realm that is much more real than the one we live in. Okay? That they would argue that what we experience here in the world is kind of a sort of a illusion. It's like you're having a dream, and you'll wake up from it and you'll discover that reality is quite different. If you've ever had a vivid dream, you can imagine this. I remember as a boy being very tired and going to sleep one night and waking up the next morning, the sun was shining in the window, and it was like the night had gone just like that. And I went from one reality to the other. But they would argue that our experience here is kind of like a dream, a very vivid dream. But you'll get beyond it. Maybe when you die, you'll discover that the real things are beyond this. New Age people subscribe to this ontology. To some extent, Hinduism subscribes to this, that you have to escape this reality by transcendental means to get to what's really real. See? This one here, spiritualized ontology. A materialist one, this one believes that the supernatural realm is an illusion. It's a creation of human minds just because we did it. The natural realm is all there is, and so they would discount that. And actually, this is a better picture of it. There's only the bottom half of the circle. The top half is completely nonsense. Okay, no external forces are allowed. There's no explanation of beginnings. That's a materialist one. This is a very powerful one today, and it's growing very rapidly, especially in the Western world. It's destroying or replacing the other views of reality quite rapidly. This one's a little more difficult to explain, sacral dualism. This is the one that those of us in the Western world paternalistically refer to as pertaining to primitive cultures. I don't like to talk about primitive anymore. I think I have to find another word, but I haven't found one yet. But this one believes that there are 2 realms. There's a supernatural realm that is filled with all kinds of entities. Most of them are bad. There are evil spirits, there are demons, there are things in medieval Europe. There were hobgoblins and ghosts and who knows what else. And the whole concern here is that this supernatural realm is very closely intertwined with the natural realm. And so you might be going along and a demon might confront you, or a hobgoblin, or a who knows what. And so there's a lot of superstition and fear. And the goal of living here is to use things like divination and magic and votive offerings to keep the evil things away from you. And I can never talk about this without remembering a Vietnamese student I had. When I was talking about this in class one day, he started laughing. And I said to him, I said, "What's so funny?" He said, "Man," he said, "you are explaining to me why my grandmother, every night in Vietnam, she would put food out on the front step for the ancestors. And in the morning she would go out there and the food was gone. And she would come in and say, well, the ancestors are happy. They came and took the food." And he says, "I was suspicious that the dogs ate it." See? And I grew up in Africa where this is a very powerful, powerful thing. And those of us in the Western world have no clue as to how powerful this ontology is. Okay? That when you are in fear of the supernatural realm and there's stuff out there to get you, you better be very careful how you conduct yourself, because not only will you bring trouble on yourself, but you could bring it on your whole community. And so there are many taboos here, and if you break a taboo, you could be kicked out of the community or even killed. Okay, this is very, very serious business. I read about a tribe up in Ethiopia that lives on a river, and they have, I should have brought that article, I forget it, but the elders, when a child is born, they look at this child, and they decide whether this child is, the word is Mingi. If the child is Mingi, this child is too dangerous to allow in the village. And so they take the child and put the child in the river, and the child is eaten by crocodiles. Okay? And there's quite a movement, especially among Christians in the area, to prevent this practice, and even the government is trying to prevent it. But they're very afraid. They say, if we quit doing this, disaster is going to come upon us. See, a very powerful thing. And one more story. I still remember I had a student from Jamaica at Walla Walla when I first started teaching there. A very gregarious guy, a lot of fun. And when I talked about this, he laughed. He said, well, they used to call me DT. He said, DT, when I was a boy in Jamaica, after school, we would all run down to the beach to play. I'd go with my friends. We would play on the beach, swimming, playing on the beach. And he said, you know, in the tropics, the sun goes down quite quickly. And many evenings we'd be so absorbed in playing there that it would get dark, and then we would have to go home. And then we realized, oh, we're in trouble, because between the beach and home is a big cemetery. And he said, when it got dark, we were very afraid. We would stop. We would stop there and think, okay, how do we go by this? And he said, of course, the longer we waited, the darker it got. And he said, suddenly one of us would just bust it, and we'd go for it, and everybody would run. He said, I never stopped running till I got inside my mother's door. And I joked, I said, well, maybe that's why Usain Bolt became such a fast runner. He used to run by the cemetery. But he was afraid, see, that something from the dark side would get him on the way by the cemetery. Very powerful ontology, and I would argue that this is probably the most pervasive ontology in all human history. This one right here. Okay, it's the most pervasive, and it exists to this day in many, many places, and is a very powerful one. This one, antagonistic dualism, this is my own name I put on here. This actually is my attempt to describe what Plato argued for, that there are two realms, the ideal realm that's perfect, and then the material realm that is diminished. And so you have these gradations of being. If you look on the left of that, there's that you start up where the spiritually pure things are, and then you go all the way down to where the brutes are that have no spiritual sensibilities. Okay, in this one, I thought that was a live slide. I think the most consequential thing I would say about this is that in this ontology, the material realm is considered to be bad. Okay, it's diminished. It's yuck. Okay, and so you have all these things that are part of the human body that are called carnal. And so you have to war against carnality, and it fuels asceticism and the idea that sex is bad and that you should eat very sparingly and pleasure is dangerous. It's all part of the material realm, and you should escape that as much as possible and just focus on that which is spiritual. That there's a big distinction between the spiritual and the secular and the sacred under this particular ontology. The last one here is called a duality, and please notice that the previous two are dualisms. That means that there are two realms that are somewhat in conflict. This is a duality, meaning that there are two realms, but they are not in inherent opposition to each other. I used to call it symbiotic dualism until a biologist got a hold of me and said I was not allowed to use that word. It had a particular meaning in biology. But This one here, there's a supernatural realm with a creator, and it's good, but there's a natural realm with created beings who have value, and the created world is good. The differentiation, though, is that there is the realm of the creator and the realm of the creature, and creatures have no access to the realm of the creator. The creator can come down into the realm of the creature, but the cardinal sin, by the way, in this ontology would be for a creature to try and usurp the prerogatives of the creator. That would be the cardinal sin. That's how you mess up this ontology. Okay. Now, I mentioned this already, that in a duality, the two realms dwell in harmony. In a dualism, they are antagonistic. So a big question, which of these concepts sits behind the Genesis 1 story? And I think you can answer that, right? It's the duality version. The duality. That's the one that's there. It's, of course, been damaged by sin. And this is a very unpopular doctrine today. The implications of a damaged duality are immense. The material realm is not inherently bad. Okay? In fact, in the creation story, it's pronounced to be good. And at the end, it said it's very good. So all the functions of materiality and the fact that we eat and that we have all these biological drives that keep us alive, these are not bad in their place. They're not bad. Okay? Eating a good lunch on Sabbath is not bad. I'm looking forward to lunch when it comes. It's a little too early to say that. Okay? Of course, it also suggests or states that humans no longer exist in their original ideal state. That's a very significant thing, and I was astonished. This doctrine is under fire in the Christian world. I have a book that I bought that argues that actually we've misunderstood the Genesis story, that God blessed humans. And one of the most egregious faults of Christianity is that we talk about how humans are cursed by sin. Happens to be a female theologian, when that's, I have to use the word she. She argues that we are badly mistaken to talk about humans as being fallen beings, that we are actually should revert to seeing ourselves as blessed. This would mean that human impulses are all corrupted and need to be bridled. Otherwise, we will find ourselves suffering from what one person called the tyranny of our desires. And if you've ever had an addiction of any kind, you will understand what the tyranny of a desire is. And there are no drives in human experience that cannot eventually captivate you. The desire for intellectual stimulation can become arrogance. Have you ever dealt with an arrogant person? Please don't answer. The desire to eat can become gluttony. The desire for sexual activity can become lust. The desire for sleep can become, what word do I want? Laziness. There's another word for it. But you see that, and I'm fascinated in Ephesians 2. The Apostle Paul says that we on our own can be enslaved by the devil, the world, and our own selves. That there are those three things that can capture us. And so it becomes a fascinating thing that self-denial and self-discipline become the pathways to human thriving. What time do I have to end, Ashley? Okay, I got a few more minutes. All right. Sorry, folks, but you already know this. Self-denial and self-discipline are the pathways to human thriving. And my prime example of that would be Olympic athletes. How do they get to be the top of the heap? By self-indulgence? No. Okay. So, humans have to go against their natural instincts and desires if they want to thrive. And this, by the way, flies very much in the face of current thought. Today we are told to look inside ourselves and find whatever desires we have and unbridle them, and that's the pathway to authenticity. This, I believe, is one of the major reasons Christianity is being more and more despised and cast aside in the Western world. I am a pristine, authentic self, and you're telling me I'm damaged. Thank you, I'm done with you. That's the attitude that exists today. And this is a very significant piece here. Oh, I'm at the end. Look at that. So I've kind of run through this, I think. I worry about the clock because I do believe in linear time. But and so do you. But we have a few minutes. I'm particularly concerned about the first part where I talked about this debate about the relationship of time to reality. That's a very abstract but a very, very significant piece. And I don't expect that any of you will be able to describe it in detail. I hope that you have just glimpsed the fact that this debate about whether reality is static or dynamic, which sits behind this story, which suggests that it's dynamic, is a huge issue in history and in Christian thought, and picking the wrong side of that, in my opinion, has actually brought about all kinds of funny stuff into Christian theology that's not biblical. So, does anybody have a comment or a question? Remembering that time is linear. Oh, yes, sir.
Yes, I represented a lot of Catholics who in their childhood had been sexually abused. And one thing they came up with, and I'm just curious about your reaction, it wasn't my idea, but that sexual abuse by a priest was murder of a child's soul.
Well, I don't know that I am able to comment on that. I know quite a bit about Catholic theology, but I don't think it's possible to murder a soul because they're inherently immortal. And so I would think that that was a metaphorical statement, that the damage done to a child is immense. So, but yeah, I don't think it's possible to actually terminate a soul. I don't. So, but thank you. Was there some? Yes, please.
Thank you for that, by the way. I'm going to try to express two questions that I hope I can meld into one here. First is, given your explanation there, I've always been a little more comfortable with the idea that God is everlasting and temporal versus atemporal, and more than just for philosophical reasons. From what I understand and have looked into, anytime the Bible talks about eternity, it's not describing eternity in an atemporal way. Like, they didn't really have a concept of that. It was more of a everlasting kind of a comment. And there's lots of reasons to see that in the way God is described in the Bible, but I'm most struck by, when Jesus is nailed to the cross and then he's resurrected, he still has scars in his hands, and apparently will always have those. And we would look at that as maybe a change and an imperfection, but it's really perhaps a description of, his perfect, loving character, and those changes are allowed as long as it's consistent with his constant, perfect, loving character.
Yeah. Yeah, I would respond this way, is that I don't mean to suggest that God is a temporal being like we are. There's a middle category that's sometimes called temporal eternality, that God has access to time, but is not limited by time. And I had a physics student years ago who helped me understand that. He said, well, it's kind of like you picture a football field. Sorry to bring football to church. Okay, but if you picture the football field with its 100 yards with the markers, we are like the players on the field, that if I want to go from midfield to the end, I have to cross 50 yards. Okay, I can't. But God is like that camera that can be moved to any point on the field. I don't know who knows how those things are controlled, but there's this little camera that hangs there and can be moved all over the place. So God has access to time, but he's not limited by time. You and I are limited by time. And so if you think of the temporal eternality, that God is not aloof from time or outside of time, but he's not limited by time like we are. So I don't know if that helps.
Well, that kind of leads into my second kind of idea, and I know none of this is provable. Is there room for a bit of a both and? When scientists, talk about the Big Bang that happened 13 billion years ago, and 13 billion years is nothing for God, and I don't necessarily, the evidence seems to be somewhat, like, you could hard to disagree with that, with what they present, but it doesn't bother me that maybe God started his creation process 13 billion years ago. He just didn't maybe create people then, obviously.
Yeah.
And so, is that when he kind of entered time with us, and before that, maybe he was kind of an outside of a time God?
Well, you're asking me to probe the mysteries of God, and I would just tell you a funny story. I don't disagree with you. To me, it doesn't matter when God created matter. Okay, it could be 13 billion years ago. It makes no difference to me. The world, the cosmos might be very old. And there's a big debate when it says God created the heavens and the earth. We know what the earth means, but what does heavens mean? And it depends on your cosmology. If you adopt the sacred cosmology of the Bible, then it would mean the earth and the sun, moon, and stars, okay, as they understood it. If you're a quantum person, then the heavens would be the whole of the universe. And I don't think we can settle that. But the funny story is, years ago, in early Christian history, somebody asked a wise man what God was doing before he created us. And the wise man thought for a while, and he said, well, I think he was creating a place in hell for those who ask probing questions. So I'm not applying that to you. It just triggered in my mind. That was a funny response. God was busy creating a place in hell for people who ask questions. I see a hand over here. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Just a quick question. As you were going around that circle and the ontological views, is ontological the same as a worldview?
Yeah, a worldview is a description of reality, and ontological is a technical word for the picture of reality that you have.
Okay, good.
Yeah. And I'm sorry about the words, folks. I didn't invent them. In fact, it's been one of the struggles of my life over the last 30 years to read this stuff, having not been trained in philosophy, and to have to figure out what all these words mean. So, yes.
In quantum physics, scientists discuss the concept of time dilatation. And so I was wondering how this might play into our discussion of ontology if a second can be shorter or longer now, or a minute or an hour, than it was 6,000 years ago or 20,000 years ago.
Yeah. I have to confess that your question puts me in over my head. I don't know enough about quantum physics to be able to answer your question. I apologize to you. But I'm fortunate that there's two kinds of knowledge, that which you know and that which you can discover. So I'll have to put that in the other category. I have a friend who's a physicist, and I talk about these things, and you know, the problem with life is we get too soon old and too late smart. And the older you get, the more you realize how much you don't know. And some people say that you never know more than when you graduated from college. So, please.
Isn't predicating anything on reality somewhat risky? Because the reality of a moment ago is different than the reality of now, and the reality in a few moments will be different than the reality of right now.
Well, I would argue that actually there is a certain way in which reality is construed. Okay? I mean, I used this example for years, that if I said to you folks over here, look, folks, we're going to make pizzas, and over here, you can make pizza any way you want. We don't care what you do. You can put grass clippings in it if you want. But over here, you guys are going to have the recipe from the most famous pizzeria, and you can pick Chicago or New York. They have a big fight as to who makes the best pizza. So you can pick, you're going to have the recipe from the best pizzeria in, I'll say Chicago because it's closer. Whose pizza do you think you want to eat afterwards? Yeah, because there is a way in which, and I think that while there are elements of reality that change, there is a basic reality that exists. The universe is a certain way. And that belief actually is what gave rise to science in the Christian world. So I agree that things change along the way, but there's also a sense in which reality is reality. And you can deny it if you want, but sooner or later it will run over you if you get it wrong. So, yeah, thank you. Well, folks, I think our time is done, so thank you for your interest. Oh, there's one more? I can't see. Oh, yeah, okay.
The Revelation where it says that time will be no more, and we often interpret whatever that is, as to no more prophetic time. But do you think that linear time might change when we get to heaven?
Yeah, I think that that when the history of this world is over and Jesus comes, I think that we will be lifted out of the temporality that we're stuck in. I think that's one of the consequences of sin, because Adam and Eve had, I think they had what we call conditional immortality. That if they had remained with the plan that God, the way God made them, they would never have died. See? But when they broke that, then they became subject to death. And I think that when Jesus comes, those who are saved will escape the temporal trap that we're in, and we will again have, I think, conditional immortality. So, thank you, folks. I'm always encouraged when people show interest in this stuff, because I sometimes worry that it's a little crazy. I shouldn't say that. Thank you. I'll see you this afternoon, those of you who are brave enough to come. Okay, yeah.
So if you don't know the restroom, we're talking to people.
Okay,
They
no,
often queue
no,
up
no,
to ask questions.
I got to
I'll
do.
grab your arms